Welcome back. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Mondays through Fridays, you hear me on the Salem Radio Network from 6 to 9 a.m. But on Saturday mornings, you hear me right here on MSNBC. Ross Douthat is a columnist at the New York Times and the author of a controversial new book about Pope Francis, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. Ross joins me this morning from New York, and before going to break, Ross, I made reference to two things. The first was the Joseph Stalin snide question long ago, how many divisions does the Pope have? And the second to your book's often surprising and even shocking review of the management style of Pope Francis, beloved around the world, but it turns out ruthless within the Vatican. In fact, the most controversial conclusion in your book, I think, is on page 201. Quote, Rome under Francis is much like Washington under Trump, a paranoid and jumpy place full of ferment and uncertainty. You also observed that Francis's opponents, like the presidents, feel like they are resisting an abnormal leader. Let's start there. Why the comparisons between the president and the Pope?
Because they're both populist figures, elected within tradition-bound institutions, who are impatient with norms and rules and sort of, you know, the way things have always been done that seems to get in the way of their agenda. And I'm not, you know, when I make evocative Trump-Francis comparison, I'm not making any kind of comparison between the specifics of their agenda. In fact, if you take them as political actors, obviously Trump is very much a conservative or right-wing populist, and Pope Francis's political interventions lean to the left. But in the context of Washington, D.C. and Rome, they're both sort of similar embodiments of popular discontent with Western institutions. They've both entered in certain ways into institutions that seem to be in crisis, and they both have a kind of vision of, you know, making America great again, making Catholicism relevant again, let's say.
Yeah, you know, you could actually have a successor volume to change a presidency or to change an institution because they both work through calculated ambiguity. One of the things that arrived on me, I told you on my radio show, I found your book engrossing and disturbing and saddening in many respects. We'll talk about why. But the Trump-Francis use of ambiguity, their speech in half words and in footnotes and in asides, it's very striking, actually, that they leave themselves every opportunity to go in any direction, usually a divisive one.
Yeah, and I think some of that is sort of, again, a kind of populist politician's instinct. I think in Francis's case, it's more strategic than in Trump's. I was listening to you guys talk before and debating whether Trump is sort of practicing the Mad Men theory or just trying to keep everybody guessing. And I think with Trump, it's much more, you know, you're trying to keep everybody guessing because Trump himself doesn't know from day to day exactly where he's going. With Francis, it's different because Francis is in this strange position as a would-be liberalizing pope, right, who wants, I think it's pretty clear at this point, to sort of generally open up Catholic debates about a whole range of doctrines up to and including the very existence of hell, which he was quoted in a sort of hard to tell whether it was real interview questioning just before Easter. And then typically, he wants a kind of truce on some uncertain terms with the sexual revolution around all of these issues, divorce and remarriage, same-sex marriage, and so on, that have been so fraught for the Church's relationship to its own flock and to the Western world. But he's the Pope, and he's not supposed to change anything, right? You know, if you want to be technical about it, the Pope is this absolute monarch whose power is circumscribed by the fact that he is supposed to act completely in continuity with his predecessors. So Francis makes these ambiguous moves, opening communion to remarried Catholics through a footnote in an incredibly long papal document, or giving these interviews with a secular atheist Italian journalist who doesn't take notes, and therefore the Vatican can always say, well, we don't think this quite accurately reflects what Francis says, even as he says things that if he said them explicitly would be sort of earth-shattering coming from a pope. So he moves this way because of the rules of the office require him to move ambiguously if he wants to make these changes.
But what's alarming is you can't walk away from to change the church without thinking to yourself, we're headed towards a schism. We're both Catholics, and so people should know that. But I take away from it, the Pope is playing such hardball politics, passing over Archbishop Gomez, who leads the largest congregation in the United States and was born in Mexico City, or Archbishop Chaput in Philadelphia, who's a Native American. Both men would have bridged the gap between sort of conservative theology and progressive politics, because they're both advocates for the undocumented, for the poor and the dispossessed. But Francis has no time for his opponents. He just lops them off and pushes them aside. Are you shocked that the world has such a different view of, the kindly pastoral Pope, but he played like the hardest of hardball inside the Vatican?
Well, he's playing hardball against Catholic conservatives, who are not always, I think, as you and I know well, the favorite figures of the mainstream press and the mainstream media. And so I think to maintain an image which is real. He really is a charismatic figure who knows how to sort of vividly embody images from the New Testament, to sort of imitate Christ with these public gestures. He's able to maintain that side of his image while also playing hardball, in part because his opponents are also the wing of Catholicism, the side of Catholicism that the media and the people who like the Pope tend to think deserve to lose, right? I mean, ultimately, there's a general media assumption that eventually, maybe 50 years, maybe 200 years, the Catholic Church has to evolve in the direction that much of liberal Protestantism has evolved in. And so when you have a Pope who's trying to do that in this sort of complicated, ambiguous, fraught way, I think it's very normal that the media would be sort of a little more forgiving and more on his side than they would be when a more conservative Pope is playing hardball in this kind of way.
You summed it up. Pope Francis is a combination of, quote, German theology, Argentinian economics, and Eurocrat assumptions about borders and nations. That is just a wonderful phrasing of what comes down to, though, a Pope who could very well land the Church in a schism, because he doesn't say what most often needs to be said, that the gospel is true, and that we really do believe it and have believed it for 2,000 years. Has he erred too much on fighting the liberal conservative fight and missing the grand opportunity that was in front of him?
Well, I think what you said before about this idea of Catholicism as really one of the few institutions in the Western world that does sort of bridge liberal-conservative divides. Like, it's no secret the Church's economic message, while it's open to all kinds of interpretations, does lean a little bit away from sort of libertarianism, free market economics, and so on. But at the same time, the Church's message on marriage, family, and sexuality is, from the point of view of our society, conservative. It starts with radicalism, right? The New Testament is a document, but at this point it's a conservative message, and that combination is distinctive. And I think in the beginning of the Francis pontificate, in this era when everything's up for grabs and the Republican Party has gone populist and centrist governments in Europe are toppling, there was a big opportunity for a Pope this sort of charismatic and beloved to present Catholicism as a real alternative to both right and left. And instead, I think by taking the Church sort of deeper back into these debates from the 1970s over, how much it can adapt to the sexual revolution and so on, he's missed that opportunity and has just in effect plunged Catholicism back into civil war, which his defenders would say, is necessary. You have to fight your way through that civil war to get to new growth and evangelization and so on. But how you get through it is a question that certainly, I mean, in this book, I try and tell the story, but I'm not at all certain how the story ends.
Nobody is, but boy, do you lay out the outlines of it and the possible endings. The book is To Change the Church, the author Ross Douthat. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you,
Back
Hugh.
in just a moment with